July 3rd, 1988, a month before the Iran-Iraq War ended, an American warship known as the Vincennes shot down an Iranian passenger jet over the Persian Gulf. 290 innocent civilians were killed. While battling Iranian gunboats, Captain Will Rogers III mistakenly thought his ship was about to be attacked by a hostile Iranian F-14 jet fighter. He ordered a missile launch.
Oh, shit! Coming down. Slow down. We had him, got it. That was dead on.
The Iranian airliner lost a wing and plummeted into the sea, smashing to pieces on impact. Only then did the crew of the Vincennes realize that they may have committed a terrible blunder. Iranian boats in the area soon began recovering the bodies. 11 hours later, Admiral William Crowe, chair of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, told a Pentagon press conference that the captain and crew of the Vincennes could not be held responsible for what had happened.
In evaluating information available from the Persian Gulf, we believe that the cruiser USS Vincennes, while actively engaged with threatening Iranian surface units and protecting itself from what was concluded to be a hostile aircraft, shot down an Iranian airliner over the Straits of Hormuz. The U.S. government deeply regrets this incident.
Admiral Crowe said Captain Rogers was protecting his ship from attack by what he thought was an F-14 fighter plane, not an A-300 Airbus. The next day, President Ronald Reagan returned to Washington from Camp David. He confirmed Crowe's statement. Although he regretted the loss of life, he said that the tragedy was nothing more sinister than a case of mistaken identity.
I won't minimize the tragedy. We all know that it was a tragedy. But we're talking about an incident in which a plane on radar was observed coming in the direction of a ship in combat, and the plane began lowering its altitude. And so I think it was an understandable accident to shoot and think that they were under attack from that plane.
But the United States account was already being challenged in Tehran, the Iranian capital. The Iranian government, led by the austere cleric Ayatollah Khomeini, condemned the United States. Angry crowds poured onto Iranian streets, and in the U.S., the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations demanded an apology.
It is indeed the obligation of U.S. Authorities to make an apology. But can an apology wash away the blood of 290 innocent people? No, by no means.
Serious questions arose about how the crew of the Vincennes could possibly mistake a European-made A-300 Airbus for an American F-14 fighter plane, even if the F-14 was now part of the Iranian Air Force. The Vincennes was an Aegis-class cruiser. It was one of the U.S. Navy's most expensive surface warships, designed to track and shoot down as many as 200 incoming missiles at the same time. Equipped with hundreds of millions of dollars worth of sophisticated radar and electronic equipment, the Vincennes computers were capable of tracking and identifying any aircraft within a 300-mile range. With such technology, it seems incredible that the crew of Vincennes failed to distinguish between an Airbus passenger jet and a fighter plane barely a third its size. The Pentagon continued to insist that it was nothing more than a tragic accident.
And the signals that we were receiving, that the Vincennes was receiving from that aircraft, were signals that we had previously identified or associated with an F-14.
At the time, the Vincennes was part of a U.S. and British naval fleet patrolling the restricted waters of the Strait of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf. It was enforcing an embargo on Iran, which most Western countries regarded as a pariah. The fleet was also protecting oil tankers and merchant ships sailing to and from Iraq and Kuwait. More than half the world's oil supply passed through the Persian Gulf. The tankers were at their most vulnerable in the Strait of Hormuz, which narrowed to a mere 32 miles. Every ship in the region was in constant danger from mines. Iranian gunboats also harassed the merchant ships. More irritating than dangerous, this was a reminder that Iran could strike at any time. As dawn had broken on July 3, 1988, the Vincennes was on patrol in the Gulf as usual. 2 other U.S. ships were in the vicinity, the frigates Montgomery and Sides. The Montgomery was about 50 miles northeast of the Vincennes when it spotted a group of gunboats milling around a tanker. A report went back to fleet headquarters in Bahrain. It was around 6:30 in the morning. The temperature was already 100 degrees, and wind which blew across the water from the Arabian desert filled the air with fine sand. The yellow haze made visibility less than perfect. A signal was sent to Captain Rogers on the Vincennes, requesting him to move toward the Montgomery. Rogers sent his reconnaissance helicopter to monitor the Iranian gunboats. Captain Richard McKenna, the Bahrain-based chief of surface warfare in the Gulf, made it clear to Rogers that the Vincennes was to stay clear while the helicopter was in the air. McKenna was concerned that more gunboats might arrive in the area. Montgomery made sure the Iranian gunboats didn't get too close. Rogers then heard from his helicopter crew that the Iranian gunboats were firing on them. He increased Vincennes' speed to 30 knots and raced to the scene. As he did, Iran Air Flight 655 prepared to take off from Bandar Abbas in southern Iran. The Airbus was due to make a short routine flight across the Gulf to Dubai. The crew and passengers could not have known it was a journey from which they would never return. By July 1988, the war between Iran and Iraq had been raging since September 1980, when Iraq invaded Iran. It was one of the most pointless and destructive wars of the 20th century. Hundreds of thousands died in a dispute over the precise border between the two countries. A particular area of disagreement was the Shatt al-Arab, a river estuary that was Iraq's only outlet to the sea. In January 1979, the Shah of Iran had been toppled in a religious revolution led by the Ayatollah Khomeini. Khomeini turned the country into an Islamic Republic. This was perceived as a direct threat to neighboring Iraq, which was ruled by the brutal Saddam Hussein. On September 22, 1980, Iraqi troops marched into Iran, quickly overwhelming small border units. The war would drag on for 8 years. Within months, a stalemate was reached, both sides attempting to take the advantage. Battles were fought from street to street. Iraqi and Iranian civilians caught up in the conflict suffered terribly as their cities came under attack. The war finally ended in August 1988 after the two countries agreed to a ceasefire brokered by the United Nations. Neither side had gained a thing. Although the United States was not formally at war with either Iraq or Iran, tension mounted between all three countries. On May 17, 1987, the U.S. frigate Stark was attacked by an Iraqi fighter bomber. 37 sailors died. The captains of all U.S. vessels patrolling the Persian Gulf knew that at any time they could come under fire from either Iraqis or Iranians. Captain Rogers of the Vincennes was no exception. He had been commissioned in 1965 and rose quickly. In 1987, he was given command of the Vincennes, a billion-dollar Aegis-class cruiser. Soon the Vincennes was on patrol duty in the Persian Gulf. If provoked, it was to search out and destroy Iranian land-based underground missile sites. On the morning of July 3, 1988, Rogers heard that Iranian gunboats were harassing shipping. He dispatched the Vincennes reconnaissance helicopter as instructed. The SH-60B Seahawk soon found the gunboats and hovered over them, awaiting further orders. By now, the Vincennes was 40 miles further north than it should have been. The Omani Coast Guard ordered the ship to turn around and head south. U.S. Navy headquarters in Bahrain issued the same order. But then Captain Rogers received a message from the Vincennes' two-man helicopter crew. The Iranian gunboats were firing on them. Captain McKenna spoke about this later.
Shortly thereafter, the Hilo reported taking shots, or I should say that the Vincennes reported to me that the Hilo had reported taking shots.
This was enough for Rogers. He now pushed the Vincennes ahead at full speed. He was determined to destroy the gunboats. His decision would lead to the disastrous blunder that claimed the lives of nearly 300 innocent people. News that the Vincennes helicopter had been fired upon by Iranian gunships reached other U.S. warships, including the aircraft carrier Forrestal. It was 200 miles away in the Gulf of Oman. 2 F-14s and 2 A-7 attack planes took off to investigate. The pilots were instructed not to take part in any ensuing action. The pilots were told to head for a point 50 miles from the Strait of Hormuz. Once there, they would be just minutes from the Vincennes, which was still being monitored by the Omani Coast Guard and the U.S. Naval Headquarters in Bahrain. At 9:48 a.m., the Vincennes' Captain Rogers reported that he had reached the Iranian gunboats and was about to open fire, even though a sandy haze obscured visibility. The Vincennes was now well inside Iran's 12-mile limit.
Officer deck, presently hold the ship crossing the Iranian declared war zone line.
The crew readied the ship's guns. The Montgomery, which had spotted the Iranian gunboats in the first place, also prepared for battle.
All hands man your battle stations.
The Vincennes and the Montgomery opened fire on the Iranian gunboats. Meanwhile, high overhead, Iran Air Flight 655 flew into the combat zone. The passenger jet was asked by the Vincennes to identify itself. There was no response. The battle with the Iranian gunboats continued. The civilian airliner was then identified on screen as an Iranian F-14. Captain Rogers ordered a missile launch. 2 deadly SM-2s streaked toward their target, which was now 11 miles away.
Oh, dead. Coming down. Coming down. We had him, got it. That was dead on. Relax. Keep it on down. Knock it off.
The plane plunged into the sea. There were no survivors. Later, it was discovered that as the missiles had been homing in on the passenger jet, its captain was busy reporting his position to air traffic control. All 4 of his radio bandwidths had been taken up with air control communication. He heard none of the warnings from Vincennes. Those aboard Flight 655 paid a terrible price for this. As the crew of the Vincennes watched search boats scour the area, it realized the awful truth. President Reagan rejected comparisons to Russia's downing of a South Korean airliner in 1983.
With regard to the Soviets comparing this to the KAL shoot-down, there was a great difference. Our shot was fired as the result of a radar screen of a plane approaching it at quite a distance. Remember, the KAL, a group of Soviet fighter planes went up, identified the plane for what it was, and then proceeded to shoot it down. There's no comparison.
Captain Rogers and his crew were later given a hero's welcome when they returned to San Diego at the end of their Gulf tour. A naval board of inquiry had cleared them of deliberately shooting down the Iranian airliner. The incident was blamed on human error combined with combat-induced stress. Iran, however, continued to condemn the United States.
We are outraged that the American officials have considered the shooting down of a passenger plane by their missiles a good judgment on the part of the naval unit. This is the clear indication of the warmongering and aggressive mentality prevalent within the top echelons of American policymakers.
The victims' funerals in Bandar Abbas attracted large crowds. The mourners cried out for revenge against the United States. For a while, it was even thought that retribution for the Iranian accident was behind the bomb blast on Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. But such was not the case. The Vincennes disaster marked the first time the U.S. military shot down a civilian airliner. The blunder would haunt the Pentagon for years.